She was just an ordinary passenger, carrying a life inside her, when the flight took a turn no one could have predicted. The hum of the engines was familiar and comforting at first, but then, without warning, the cockpit went completely silent. Panic rippled through the cabin as the flight attendants tried to stay calm, but it was clear something was terribly wrong. Nobody knew what had happened, and fear hung heavy in the air. As the seconds stretched, a voice crackled over the radio, a military call, F-16s, Phantom 1, we have a situation. That's when reality hit. Fighter jets were now in the sky, escorting their plane, and the world outside the windows suddenly felt far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. She clutched her belly, her heart pounding, realizing this was no ordinary flight anymore. Every passenger stared at her, half in hope, half in fear, wondering if she could somehow be the key to what was unfolding. With the cockpit dark and no guidance, and the F-16 signaling urgency, the question lingered, could they land safely, or was this flight heading toward disaster? What happens next would change everything, and no one on board was ready for it. No one knew exactly what had happened in the cockpit. Some whispered about a sudden medical emergency, others feared a mechanical failure, but the truth was stranger than anyone could guess. She sat frozen in her seat, her hands resting protectively on her belly, listening to the low roar of the fighter jets above. The F-16s weren't just there for show, they were sending a warning, a signal that this was no ordinary flight, and everyone on board felt it in their bones. She hadn't planned to be in this situation. Just hours ago, she had been excited, imagining a quiet journey, thinking about the baby she carried and the life waiting for her at the destination. Now, she was thrust into something far beyond her control. The other passengers began sharing anxious glances, murmuring theories, trying to make sense of the radio calls they barely understood. Outside, clouds swirled around the sleek silhouettes of the F-16s, like shadows guarding a secret. Every moment, the silence from the cockpit grew heavier, pressing down on the cabin. Questions piled up. Who was flying the plane? Why were the military jets called in? And most importantly, could she survive this, both for herself and the baby? The answers were nowhere in sight, and the tension only tightened with every passing second. The tension inside the cabin was almost unbearable. Some passengers tried to calm themselves with small talk, but every rattling noise from the plane made hearts leap. Flight attendants moved quickly, checking on those who were panicking, but even they were uncertain, trained for emergencies, yet unprepared for silence in the cockpit. She could see the fear in their eyes, mirroring her own, but something inside her shifted. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She felt a strange responsibility to stay calm, for the baby, for the people around her. From the back of the plane, a man whispered about conspiracies, about hijackings and secret military operations, his voice trembling. Others argued quietly over what the radio signals had meant, trying to piece together a story from fragments. Outside the windows, the F-16s held their positions, shadows against the clouds, relentless and imposing. The jet's presence only raised more questions. Were they escorting the plane to safety, or keeping it under watch for something worse? Meanwhile, she noticed a small crew member near the cockpit door, whispering urgently into a headset. Their movements were quick, almost frantic, signaling that whatever was happening wasn't just mechanical, it involved people, decisions, and unknown dangers. Every passenger felt it. The flight was no longer just a journey, it had become a test of nerves, courage, and survival. And the clock was ticking. The cabin was electric with fear. Every passenger was on edge, gripping their armrests, staring at the darkened cockpit door. The low rumble of the engines was now a heartbeat, ominous and unrelenting. Outside, the F-16s darted in precise formation, their sleek forms slicing through clouds, a silent warning and a promise of authority. She pressed her hand against her belly, feeling the tiny flutter inside, and realized the life she carried depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Suddenly, the small crew member near the cockpit stiffened, whispering into the headset with urgency that made the hair on her arms rise. The murmurs among the passengers turned into panicked speculation. What if the plane couldn't be landed safely? What if the silence in the cockpit meant no one was in control? Every angle seemed more terrifying than the last, and yet she felt a strange clarity. This wasn't the time to freeze. A sharp jolt shook the cabin, sending trays clattering to the floor. The F-16s adjusted their positions immediately, as though reacting to the sudden instability. A pilot's voice crackled over the radio, distorted but commanding. "Phantom 1, this is your last window to respond. You must act now." Her heart raced, and the passengers exchanged terrified glances, realizing that the climax of their ordeal was arriving, and no one could predict what would happen next. Just as a tense silence settled over the cabin, a new alarm blared from the cockpit, cutting through the roar of the engines and the distant whine of the F-16s. Red lights flashed across the control panels, and the small crew member froze mid-step, eyes wide with disbelief. Something was wrong, something far worse than anyone had imagined.